Okay, as I'm wont to do, 30,000-foot view of the Bible, the entire Bible from Genesis 1 all the way through Revelation. If you were to put it in a nutshell, three statements, what would they be, Adam? I'm going to get it right one of these times. That we stress with their kids' classes in the back. The overall theme of the Bible. Yes. Thank you, Dan. You get the star tonight. Okay, before creation, God had a plan. The problem really is sin, and the answer is Jesus. If you were to just sum the Bible up in a few short statements, I believe that would be it. How did things get so messed up, and what is God doing about it to fix the problem? I think it's important to do this from time to time. I do it regularly when I teach the class, because especially when you're doing textual studies like we've been doing, where we're going through book after book after book, it's easy to forget the big picture and to start thinking the Bible is just a series of unrelated stories with their own morals and so forth and so forth. But it's really one story. Okay, Adam, what comes next? The plan that God had can be, the broad outline of it is what? What you always answer when I am asking this question. The promises to Abraham. The rest of the Bible from Genesis 12, for the most part, I guess it's a little bit of an overstatement. The rest of the Bible from Genesis 12, for the most part, has something to do with the land, the nation, or the seed promise that God's fulfilling. All right. In the Hebrew Bible, I understand that Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings is one big long scroll, going from 1400 to 586 BC, when Judah fell, or Jerusalem fell. So obviously there's numerous authors, but it's one long scroll. And so whether you were using the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint translators that broke it into separate books like we're doing, I think it's important from time to time to kind of take stock. Where have we been? Where are we going? And so forth. Just to have the broader context as we come down from 30,000 to 10,000, now a little bit more specific. But before you even start with the long scroll with the book of Joshua, you can actually go to Deuteronomy. And it's fascinating to me that when you read Deuteronomy, as the children of Israel are getting ready to enter the promised land, Moses has a series of speeches, and he tells them many things that are going to happen, things they should do, things they should not do. And it's almost like history written in advance, which would be for the proof that Moses was inspired. One of the things Moses tells them is that when they come into the land, God is going to choose a place for his name to dwell, or to make his habitation. And we've already, through our studies, have kind of traced the trek of the ark, and David has finally got in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, of course, it's going to become the place of worship. And so Moses telegraphed years in advance that there would be a central place of worship, and that's where you're supposed to go to offer your sacrifices and the feasts and all that sort of thing. So we get that in Deuteronomy even before we start the long scroll. Another thing that Moses indicated is that at some point there would be a king. He says it's important that God chooses the king. And in Deuteronomy 17, there's a whole list of things that the king should do and things that the king should not do. And I suspect in upcoming weeks, as we look at Solomon's reign, that we'll be coming back to this regularly. So Deuteronomy 17. So history written in advance. There's going to be a central place of worship, and there will in fact be a king in a kingdom. Okay, so we start in Joshua, and what would you say was the big takeaway from the book of Joshua that just keeps resounding even through tonight? That's something that has just plagued the Israelites. Kind of a read my mind type question. What was the big failure in Joshua? They didn't drive out the inhabitants. They didn't wipe them out. Think, for example, if they had obeyed that, the Philistines we've been studying about, they've been coming up week after week after week. Just think how different the history of Israel could have been if they had obeyed Moses and God and had actually wiped out the inhabitants of Canaan. So the big takeaway for me from Joshua, or one of the big takeaways, is their failure to destroy the inhabitants of the land. The repeated refrain in Judges, kind of harkening back to Deuteronomy almost, is there was no king, and every person did what was right in their own eyes. Kind of similar to today. I just make up my own morals and my own truth and so forth, which is just ludicrous. All right, in 1 Samuel, we suggested there was at least 3 things that to keep in mind or that were introduced. It was prophesied early on in the book of 1 Samuel that Eli, his household would be removed from serving as priest. And that's prophesied, but it's not accomplished in 1 Samuel. Matter of fact, it hasn't been accomplished in 2 Samuel either. In 1 Samuel, we start seeing the ascendancy of David. It's prophesied that he's going to be king. He's anointed, but he's not actually king in 1 Samuel. And we also have in 1 Samuel, David making a vow to Jonathan that he would look after his descendants. So those 3 ideas, among other things, were introduced in 1 Samuel that we have been tracking. So we get into 2 Samuel, and we see that David did keep his vow, and he took in Mephibosheth basically as one of his own, and David obviously becomes king, and throughout the book of 2 Samuel, it's about his reign, but the prophecy about Eli still has not been fulfilled. All right, in 2 Samuel, some things that are introduced that we want to keep tracking from here forward is David, speaking of the central place of worship, he wants to build a house for the Lord, but he's told he could not. However, he's told that his son will. There's a conditional promise made to David that if his sons are faithful, he'll not lack a man on the throne, but it's conditional for their being faithful. There's an extraordinary promise made to David that one of his descendants will set up an everlasting kingdom. Obviously, we'll be tracking that for a long time. And as I think Bobby pointed out initially when he was teaching about Absalom's rebellion, and I think Justin hit on it too, it seems that the seeds of bitter division that would eventually lead to civil war may have started in the aftermath of the Absalom rebellion, as far as how David was restored, and how there's a fallout between the 10 tribes and the tribe of Judah. At that point, that seems to be simmering beneath the surface that will explode. So we'll continue to see how God directs history according to his purposes, and those are the 4 or 5 things that would suggest that we keep our eyes out for as we get into 1 Kings. All right, long introduction, and chapter 1 I think has something like 53 verses, but we can condense it actually quite a bit, because it tells about how Adonijah set himself up. We have Nathan telling Bathsheba, Adonijah has made himself king. We have Bathsheba telling David, Adonijah has made himself king. We have Nathan coming in and telling David behind Bathsheba that Adonijah has made himself king. And then we have David's decisive action when he hears this word. So basically we have a narrative that's told 3 or 4 times, and so we can kind of compress it a little bit. But before we get into Adonijah making himself king, there's a very interesting thing that's brought up that actually is woven into the narrative as we go forward that has some importance and some bearing. David's old and he can't stay warm. So I think I must have been old before my time. I have never been able to stay warm. So somebody has a bright idea that let's find a beautiful woman and she can lay in his arms and keep him warm. And I was reminded of his son Solomon, one of his proverbs. I wonder if he was inspired by this, 2 lying down together and keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? Who knew that Abishag might have been the inspiration for that? Anyways, but there's a little note here at the bottom. She's a beauty queen, evidently, and I thought of Esther and how they made a search throughout the land to find a beautiful woman to be queen. Anyways, they want a beautiful woman, and says she indeed was. And she attended to the king intimately, but the king did not know her. So, I mean, it was more intimate than a normal relationship, but not fully intimate, if you know what I mean. So why is that thrown in there? Well, it may be because later on, it could be that Bathsheba was kind of pulled into Adonijah's scheming, because in her mind, because the king did not know her, she did not perceive her as being equivalent to a wife or a concubine. But I would think to pretty much everybody else, if you saw Abishag, you would associate her or think of her as being part of the king's harem. So keep that in mind as we go forward, as to why Bathsheba may have been pulled into this. All right. It says, Adonijah exalted himself. No prophet is recorded as coming to Adonijah and saying, God's chosen you to be the king. He decided to take that onto himself. And then there's a very sad observation that the Holy Spirit makes about David. He said his father had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done thus and so? So he gets himself 50 men, similar to Absalom, that run before him to make a splash. And I think about his pride, let another praise you, not your own mouth. All right, looking at David. Well, actually, we can back way up. I think of Jacob. Jacob, rightly or wrongly or wisely or foolishly, had an arrangement with the men of Shechem, and Simeon and Levi snuck in behind his back and dealt very treacherously with them. What does Jacob do about it? Nothing. We think about Eli. The reason that the priesthood was removed from his household, or will be removed from his household, is because he failed to restrain his sons. Matter of fact, the Bible is so critical of him, it says that you put them before me, God saying that his failure to restrain his sons was tantamount to him putting them before God. Then you look at David's life, and the last several weeks we've been covering all these things. Just look at his failings in his family. I don't know about the cultural norms and so forth, but it just seems really sketchy to me if Amnon's feigning sickness, he says, hey, why don't you send Tamar? I think maybe David acted foolishly in doing that. But in any event, when he heard about what had happened, he did nothing. When Absalom slays Amnon, he does nothing. He doesn't make any overture to Absalom for good or ill. And to Joab kind of forces his hand, and then when he brings him back, he keeps him distance. He's not very attentive to Absalom's politicking and so forth. So this seems to be a pattern for the most part with David, the man after God's own heart, that his household was a disaster. And I've thought about this before in connection with David and Samuel and other great men of faith that is incredible as David was and as spiritually minded as he was, a man after God's own heart, he would not have been qualified to serve as an elder in the Lord's church because of his terrible failings in this matter. So that brings me to my first life principle. Parents, we have a responsibility and a duty from God to teach our children the way of the Lord. I think Deuteronomy 6, it talks about the Lord God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your kids. And if you read it, the highlighted part there, it seems like it's pretty much every moment of every day in every situation that you're always putting that before them. It is not some matter of, here's your school life, here's your social life, here's your family life, we have our church life, and so forth like that. It all radiates from God. That's first and foremost, and everything else radiates from that. And it's our responsibility. Now, obviously, you can do that, and given that your children are free moral agents just like you are, they can choose to reject it. But generally, you certainly give them every advantage if you raise your children in this manner, and it's a serious responsibility. In the New Testament, fathers provoke not your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And notice that the teaching in the New Testament, especially as far as parenting is concerned, is directed toward the fathers. Now, undeniably, the mother bears the child, obviously, and is the primary caretaker, especially when they're young, and is going to have a tremendous impact or influence on your child's spiritual development. But at the end of the day, fathers have a special responsibility and will stand before God and give account for how you were or were not the spiritual leader of your family. And a very important lesson for all of us. Any comments in this first principle taken from David's failures? All right, the players in this coup attempt. Joab and Abiathar had been loyal to David previous to this. And it even mentions in the text that Joab was with David during Absalom's rebellion, but he went with Adonijah this time. I think we can reasonably surmise that in that Joab explicitly disobeyed David. He was commanded to deal gently with Absalom, and he killed Absalom when Absalom was caught in the tree. Now, I'm not sure about what he did David a favor, because if somebody's trying to take the kingdom away, they're acting treasonous in a treasonous manner, and the way that's usually dealt with is by putting them to death. But anyways, he went against David's explicit order, and then to make the matters worse, this might have been the real one that sunk him with David, is that David appointed Amasa to be the commander going forward, and Joab killed him in cold blood. Why Abiathar flipped to Adonijah, I don't know. I was curious if anybody was aware of something in the text that I had missed that would give any indication as to why Abiathar sided with Adonijah in this case. But anyways, these are some of the co-conspirators with Adonijah. And Adonijah, when he set himself up as king, he invites all of his brothers except for Solomon, so he knows who David intends to succeed him. Benaiah was faithful to David. He was not part of this rebellion. And he was introduced in previous weeks, but he's a very interesting person. Said David reigned over all Israel, and he ministered justice and equality. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. Evidently, these were David's bodyguards, and is thought to be that they were actually mercenaries and foreigners. But unlike most mercenaries, they were fiercely loyal to David, and it wasn't about paycheck necessarily. They were loyal to David. In 2 Samuel 23, was that the mighty men that Justin talked about, says he was a valiant man, do great deeds. Says he struck down 2 Ariels of Moab, and I understand that that's a very difficult word that they're trying to translate there. And he went down in a pit and killed a lion and so forth. So he's pretty impressive. So I was looking it up, and it says the Ariel Moabs appears to be top warriors of Moab, and they said it's literally like lying like men. Okay. And as we noted earlier, these 2 groups of people are the bodyguards of David, and they also were tasked with executing the king's enemies. So Benaiah is on his side. He didn't invite Nathan, Benaiah, or Solomon. So that implies that he knew David's intention to make Solomon king, and he invited all the other king's sons, but he didn't invite Solomon. And one wonders, had he succeeded, would he had the same disposition towards Solomon that Solomon showed towards him? So Nathan comes to Bathsheba and says, hey, this is going on, and we're in trouble if this succeeds, so you need to go tell David, and I'll come in behind you and confirm the word. So that's what happens. So she goes and say, didn't you promise that you were going to make Solomon king? And is that still the case? And then Nathan comes in and confirms it. And then David says, yes, I did swear that. And if you've noticed throughout David's life, when he invokes the name of Yahweh, he's very careful to fulfill his word. And I think there's a lesson there for us that we need to keep our commitments. Now, obviously, if you swear by Yahweh or by God, you better keep your vow. He has no pleasure in food. But Christ takes it to a new level, or I would say a level that was always implied, and that is that we should be people of such character that yes or no suffices, and if you make a commitment, we keep it. I think of Psalms 15, those who honor the Lord, or those who fear the Lord, is a person who will even commit to his own hurt. It doesn't change. So if you ever made a commitment and you're saying, ooh, I shouldn't have done that, it's really going to cost me, and yet because you gave your word, you keep it anyways. All right. When they reverse the situation and they make Solomon king, one of the things they did is they put him on David's mule and he's paraded around. And that kind of, once again, reminded me of Esther, how when Haman is trying to tell the king how to honor somebody thinking it's going to be him, and he has to go out and do that for Mordecai. And they also, of course, we have Jesus' triumphant entry. So David takes action, and they do the things that would indicate that Solomon is going to succeed him and not Adonijah. And then word starts trickling back to Adonijah and his guests and the big feasting they're having. And so they kind of scatter, and Solomon's on his throne, and they bring Adonijah before him, and Adonijah is begging, paying homage to him, and said, please don't put me to death or whatever. And Solomon basically says, don't give me a reason. And we are ready for chapter 2. Any thoughts or comments before we jump into chapter 2? All right. As we jump into chapter 2, I'll trying to find a list of all of David's sons. And here's one listing that I came up with in trying to figure out birth order and so forth. Of course, we know that Amnon was put to death by Absalom. And then we notice that Absalom was put to death by Joab. And it would seem that Adonijah may have been next as far as birth order was concerned and had some claim perhaps in that regard. And he makes mention of this fact later on when he's talking to Bathsheba, but Solomon was God's choice and David's choice. All right, so here's that conditional promise that David makes, or that David reiterates that God had made to him about his successors, that if they pay close attention to their way and walk before me in faithfulness, they'll not lack a man on the throne. But earlier, when it says David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon, saying, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. I was reminded, I think it was Bobby that taught Jacob's last days back when we were studying Genesis, and he made the observation that I hadn't really thought about so many men in the Bible, as they drew near to the end of their life, would speak to their family or their sons or something very candidly about the fact that they're about to die. And I'm not suggesting that this needs to be just a morbid, obsession of ours and stuff like that. But on the other hand, as you draw near the end of your life, to act like it's never going to happen is kind of foolish too. And I suspect that's how most people live. They know in their heart of hearts you're going to die sometimes, but refuse to think about that. And because of that, often don't address things that need to be addressed that are most important. So he gives them some charges. He says, be strong and show yourself a man. I was listening to a podcast recently with the author of a book, was talking about the fact that they had gathered data from all sorts of very secular people and sociologists and anthropologists and so forth. And it seems to be almost universal, cross-cultural, throughout history, that people, men, know all over the world what it is to be a man, that they understand that that has to do with having a family, providing and protecting. And if you want to be a good man, that you need to do those sorts of things. And that's just almost intuitive, almost as if it's written on your heart. But as far as David's charge to Solomon about following his statutes and commandments and rules, in that case, we need special revelation because we can't figure it out on our own. It's not in our ability to know how to walk before the Lord as fallen creatures unless he reveals the way to us. In this case, it would be the law of Moses, obviously. I have been very critical of David as far as his parenting was concerned, but it seems like there was one exception. Proverbs 4, which was written by Solomon, Solomon says, when I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your words hold fast my words, keep my commandments, and live, get wisdom and insight, and so forth. So Solomon is saying in Proverbs 4 that when he was young, that David and Bathsheba actually taught him the way of the Lord. So David did have one success as far as parenting was concerned in regards to how he raised up Solomon. And David's charge to Solomon, and Solomon basically restates it in Ecclesiastes, is that this is our whole purpose, our whole reason for being. Of course, you know the very well-known passage in Ecclesiastes when Solomon says, the whole duty of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. But notice how closely they align with what David told Solomon. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies. Basically saying the same thing. So Solomon got it from David. And that's the whole purpose of our lives, to know God and make him known. Comments? Yes, sir.
I think as Christian parents, we've got to remind ourselves when it says, be strong and show a purpose of our man. Our culture right now is frowning on masculine men.
Oh.
I haven't watched the Barbie movie. I'm not going to watch the Barbie movie. You know, but my understanding is it absolutely crashes the idea of masculinity. This group of people we need to make sure that our young boys to be
Right. Yeah. I was listening to, I can't think of his first name, Prager. Yeah, Dennis Prager, and he, on a podcast, and he was making the case for marriage. And he was saying both men and women need this, and he was talking about a radio show that he used to host, and the lady called in. She was in her 50s, and she wanted to remain anonymous, but she said she'd been raised by a feminist mother, said, you know, get education and get out there in the career, and she had done that. She had like 4 degrees and was very successful in her career, but in her 50s and had always been single. And she was saying that I was fed a lie, and I'm so lonely, and I can't relate to anybody else because they're married and have kids and so forth. And she said it's not the life. But anyways, along with all that, of course, it's trashing manhood, fatherhood, patriarchy, and all that. Thank you. David gives Solomon some charges to deal with a couple matters, to take care of Joab and Shimei, make sure that they don't go to their grave in peace. And with Joab, he makes mention of the fact that Joab, when he slew Abner and when he slew Amasa, he killed them in a time of peace over blood that had been shed during war. And he makes a distinction between that. So he's charged to deal with these 2 men, but notice that David himself had swore to Shimei that he would not put him to death. And once again, David keeps his vow, but he's passing it on to Solomon. Use your wisdom to figure out some way to deal with these people because they're not guiltless. All right. So David dies, and Solomon has been reigning a little bit already, and now his throne is going to be firmly established. All right. So Adonijah round 2. Adonijah goes to Bathsheba, and he says, I have a little request for you. He said, you know, the kingdom was nearly mine. All of Israel expected me and so forth, but then kind of turned at the last second. He says, but how about you talk to Solomon about giving Abishag as my wife? Now Bathsheba says, okay, that sounds good. I'll go to the king about this. I think, like I said earlier, as far as perception would have been concerned, that Abishag would have been seen as part of David's harem. And so I think Bathsheba got pulled in on this one, that Adonijah still has some aspirations for the throne. And as far as we can tell from the what happens next is that Joab and Abiathar are still with him too, as far as co-conspirator. So Bathsheba goes to Solomon and makes a request for Adonijah to have Abishai. So what was David's reaction? I mean, it's David. What was Solomon's reaction? He says, why don't you just ask me to give him the kingdom? Now, why would he say that? All right. In the Bible, and then also in extra biblical texts, there's quite a tradition of, if you want to make a power play, if you take the other man's wife or his concubine, that's kind of a way of showing dominance, or like I say, make a power play. An earlier indication of this we had way back in 2 Samuel, the early part of it, when Ishbosheth was reigning after Saul, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Okay, so that's curious, because when Abner asked Ishbosheth for the concubine that Saul had, Ishbosheth takes it as a threat that Abner's trying to make a play for the kingdom. Well, based on what Abner does next, I'm not sure if that was the case in his case. But anyways, that's how kind of it was perceived. And it does note that he was making himself strong. Now, my contention is, if he had really wanted to take over the kingdom at that point, he wouldn't have gone to David, unless he was being disingenuous when he went to David. Maybe he really was. That's what Job thought anyways. But Ishbosheth draws back from this very strongly because he sees it as a power play. Would it have been unthinkable for Abner to have become king of Israel, just hypothetically? What was his relationship to Saul, besides being his commander? He was his uncle. So Ishbosheth may have good reason to be kind of scared, because Abner is Saul's uncle, and so it's not beyond the pale that he could have had, some claim to the throne after Saul was killed himself. But anyways, that really distresses Ishbosheth, and then of course we know what happens when Abner goes to David and tries to unite the kingdom. What did Absalom do to show his full intention to take the kingdom from David? Remember the counsel that, I can't ever say this guy's name, Phil said to Absalom, David left 10 concubines back when he fled Jerusalem. And he says, okay, set up a tent and go into these 10 concubines, and so that everybody will know that. And so if they're thinking that you're not fully committed to this rebellion, they'll understand otherwise. Later on in 1 Kings, one of the enemies of Ahab tells him, has these besieging, he says, your silver and gold are mine, your best wives and children also are mine. And so he mentions wives. Okay, so where would you think in the Bible it wasn't for the kingdom or to become king? Where do you think the first power play of this sort was ever made? I thought about Reuben sleeping with one of Jacob's concubines, and a consequence of that is that he lost the birthright as the eldest son, the first son. But I think there's one even before that we don't often think of. And it's one of those kind of things where, have you ever heard the Bible interprets itself? It's its own best commentary. I had never connected the dots until kind of recently. I was listening to a study in Leviticus, and there's a couple passages in Leviticus that is kind of like, oh, I think I know what was going on. In Leviticus 20, there's a euphemism here about uncovering somebody's nakedness, which is a euphemism for sexual intercourse. But look in that verse 17. Sees her nakedness or uncovers her nakedness, it's the same thing. If I see it or if I uncover it, it's a euphemistic for saying the same thing. That those are equal. Leviticus 18, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She's your mother, you shall not uncover nakedness. To uncover the nakedness of your father is to sleep with his wife or your mother, okay? Grotesque and unimaginable. Of course, we had that problem in the church at Corinth. But anyways, putting those two passages together, can you think of the first power play that was perhaps made along this line? Brad, you thought? Noah. Seeing her nakedness or uncovering the nakedness is one and the same thing, and the nakedness of your father is actually your mother. So what happens? Ham, when Noah was drunk, saw the nakedness of his father, and when he wakes up, it's kind of interesting. He says, "Cursed be Canaan." You think, where did Canaan come in all this? Canaan is the offspring of Ham. And so trying to put it together, I believe Ham was making a power play to rest. I'm the main man now when Noah was drunk and took advantage of the situation. And that's actually what went on. That's a very difficult text. But anyways, I think that might be the first occurrence if I'm correct about these passages. And like I say, the Bible is its own best commentary, so that seems to have the most explanatory power. So, anyways, when Solomon is king, he's going to take care of Adonijah. Then he starts cleaning the house. He sends Benaiah around. But one thing he does is he takes Abiathar and he says, "You deserve to die. You're part of the conspiracy with Adonijah. But I'm not going to put you to death because you carried the ark of God." So the prophecy against Eli's household is now being fulfilled. It's a note there in verse 27. What do you think about Solomon saying, "Yes, you deserve death, but because of this, I'm not going to put you to death"? And you think there's a lesson there? Well, two lessons I think we can get from that text. First of all, God's prophetic word, and remember all the way back to 1 Samuel, that Eli's household would be removed, is fulfilled. Thank you. And just an observation about prophecy. Some prophecy is just extremely clear and explicit. This is exactly what's going to happen, and then you can see it unfold. Jeremiah says the Babylonian captivity is going to be 7 years, and it was. Jesus says, "I'll rise in 3 days," and he did, and stuff. But there's also a lot of prophecy that is kind of enigma until after the fact, but it has tremendous confirmation value when you realize, oh, that's what they were talking about. So sometimes I think it's important when you're making the case that the Bible's inspired because of messianic prophecy and so forth to be sure that you are clear when you're talking to the person, so you don't misstate, not overstate. But as far as how the different prophecies work, like some of them, like say, are explicitly clear, and some of are only clear after the fact, and that's still powerful confirmation. But we shouldn't act like I can just line up all these prophecies and figure out exactly how it's going to go down. I think about how badly the religious leaders in Jesus' day, the Jewish religious leaders, missed it. I mean, just how utterly they missed it. And they knew the law backwards and forwards, and they knew the prophets backwards and forwards. And so I'm also amused sometimes when I think about all these different systems we have of eschatology, and we talk so authoritatively as if we're going to do a whole lot better than the Jews did as far as coming to the Messiah the first time. All right, but back to why didn't he put him to death? I think there's a principle there that respect and honor is due to those in authority, even if the individual themselves is unworthy. And we have sure lost that in this country. In the military, we always taught, it's the uniform, it's not necessarily the man. And if they're in authority over you, they give you a legal and moral command, you obey it. I knew some others when I was in the military. I was served during Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama before I retired. And I can tell you, some of them, my commander's chief, I thought a lot of, and some of them I didn't. But there's always respect. But I knew other people that, well, that's not your place. Respect and honor to those to whom it's due. Paul, when he was before the high priest, he said, I did not know he's high priest. And basically, I take back what I said, because you shall not speak evil of the ruler of your people. So we need to remember our attitude and the things that we say to others. And this is an area where we as Christians can stand out from those, because it should be obvious of some of the things that we approve and disapprove of, but yet we can still speak respectfully of those that are in authority over us. Comments? All right, so Benaniah goes and he puts Adonijah to death. He goes and puts Joab to death, and then Abithar's sent home, and they no longer serve as priests. And then lastly, we have Shimei. So he brings Shimei in, and very wisely says, okay, here's the deal. Build your house here in Jerusalem and don't ever leave. And if you ever do, you will be put to death. And Shimei says, that sounds great to me. And he abided by that for for 3 years. And a couple of his servants flee, and he receives word. He goes out to get them. Word comes back to Solomon that Shimei has left the environs of Jerusalem. So he calls him back in. He says, you agreed to this before the Lord, and so by your own words, and because of what you did, you're going to be put to death, and he was. So by the end of chapter 2, we have Solomon is established as king firmly. His opposition, they have been dealt with, and the throne is securely in his hand. Any final comment? Well, I appreciate your attention, and that does it for tonight.